It's 2026 in America, and power is still being exercised without responsibility, not understanding the lives of everyday people, not accountable to consequences. Just power protecting itself and money being siphoned upward while the rest of the country absorbs the stress. People are being crushed every day, and nobody in power gives a damn. And if this looks like stupidity running the country, it's because that's what corruption looks like when it doesn't even bother pretending anymore.
This is a world gone mad. This is a world gone mad. Mad, mad, mad.
I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. The start of Season 3, Episode 193. No bullshit this year, Wolfpack listeners. I'm not going to be nice anymore. I'm going to say it as it is. No spin, no talking points. I don't care who I piss off this year. If anyone doesn't like what I say, they can pound sand. If you're here for honesty and the unfiltered truth, you're welcome to stay. If not, that's your choice. Wolfpack, this is where the world goes mad. In the last 48 hours, the United States seized Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, flew him into an American courtroom, and then openly talked about running his country. Not negotiating, not assisting, running it. Government, infrastructure, oil, all of it. This isn't abstract. And it isn't symbolic. This actually happened. The sitting leader of another sovereign nation was physically taken by U.S. forces and dropped into the American legal system, and the reaction from the people in charge wasn't caution or explanation. It was confidence. It was casual. It was treated like business as usual. This is the kind of moment that's supposed to stop a democracy in its tracks. This is where Congress is supposed to be loud. This is where the press is supposed to slow everything down and ask hard questions. Instead, it's being framed as strength, decisiveness, leadership, and that framing should scare the hell out of you, no matter who you voted for. Because the issue here isn't whether you like Nicolas Maduro or you care about Venezuela. The issue is whether you're comfortable living in a country that decides it can grab the leader of another nation and then talk openly about managing that country like an asset. That's not law enforcement. That's not diplomacy. That's raw power saying we don't need permission anymore. What makes this moment so dangerous is how quickly people are being pushed to take sides instead of stopping to think. You're supposed to either cheer or dismiss it, depending on your politics, without ever asking the deeper question. What kind of precedent does this set? And who decides when it gets used again? Because once a country proves it's willing to do this, the argument stops being about one man or one nation. It becomes about a system that's discovered it can act first and explain later, knowing that outrage will burn hot for a day or two and then disappear into the noise. This is how power trains itself. It tests boundaries. It watches the response. If there's no meaningful resistance, it moves the line and calls it leadership. Over time, what once would have been unthinkable becomes normal, and what once required explanation becomes assumed. There's also a reason this is being wrapped in language about efficiency and decisiveness. People are exhausted. They're stretched thin. They don't have the time or energy to dissect foreign policy doctrine or international law. So power speaks in simple terms. We acted, we took control, we're handling it. And a lot of people, desperate for someone to sound like they know what they're doing, accept that at face value. But decisiveness without accountability isn't leadership. It's impulse with authority. And history is very clear about where that leads, even when it's wrapped in flags and promises of order. Listen to the words being used. Running a country, managing infrastructure, controlling resources. That's not accidental phrasing. That's a worldview leaking out. It reveals how leadership sees other nations, not as equals with sovereignty, but as problems to be handled and assets to be managed. Once you accept that worldview, the rest follows naturally. International norms become inconveniences. Laws become flexible. Oversight becomes optional. And anyone who questions it is told they're weak, naive, or standing in the way of progress. What's especially alarming is how quiet the internal checks have been. This is exactly the moment when legislative oversight is supposed to matter, when the public is supposed to hear clear explanations of authority, risk, and consequence. Instead, there's a lot of silence and a lot of spin. People should also pay attention to how quickly the financial consequences begin to fall into place. Switzerland moved to freeze the assets tied to Nicolas Maduro and people in his inner circle, looking down money held in Swiss banks, locking down the money held in Swiss banks so it couldn't be moved or hidden. That didn't happen after months of debate. It happened almost immediately, showing how fast global financial systems adjust when raw power asserts itself. That's the part most people never see, but it's the part that lasts the longest. None of this requires cartoon villains or secret conspiracies. It only requires a system that rewards dominance and speed while punishing restraint and deliberation. It requires a political culture that confuses action with wisdom and volume with strength. And once that culture takes hold, it doesn't matter who's in charge. The machinery keeps moving because it's learned that it can. If this makes you uncomfortable, it should. Discomfort is the correct response when power crosses lines without debate and calls it normal. When extraordinary actions are treated as routine, when the language of control replaces the language of cooperation and no one flinches. The real question isn't whether this was justified in the moment. The real question is what happens next time and the time after that, when the same logic is applied somewhere else or turned inward or used by someone far less competent or far less restrained. Power never asks permission twice. It remembers what it was allowed to do the first time. This is bigger than Venezuela. It's bigger than one president or one administration. It's about whether we still believe that power should be constrained, explained, and accountable, or whether we've decided that as long as it feels strong and sounds confident, the details don't matter. Because once a country decides it's the exception to every rule, it stops being a democracy in practice, no matter what it calls itself. And that's the part nobody should be comfortable ignoring. I said at the top of the show, and I meant it, I'm not holding back this year. I'm not protecting anyone's feelings. And it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. If they deserve to be called out, I'll call them out. So let's talk about another moment of madness that just dropped and deserves scrutiny. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz just quit his re-election race. And before anyone rushes to frame this as a graceful, personal decision, Let's be very clear about what actually happened here. This wasn't about family time. This wasn't about burnout. This wasn't about noble public service fatigue. This was about a governor realizing he could no longer outrun a welfare fraud disaster that exploded on his watch. Minnesota is dealing with one of the largest welfare fraud scandals in the country. Hundreds of millions of dollars gone. Programs designed to help children and struggling families turned into open cash machines for grifters. Child care assistance, social services, the most morally sensitive programs a government runs. And they were looted repeatedly for years. Not because the fraud was genius, not because the criminals were invisible, but because oversight was weak, warnings were ignored, and accountability was slow or non-existent. That happened under Governor Tim Walz. And no amount of careful phrasing or press management changes that basic reality. Now, before anyone screams partisan hit job, the Republicans doing this, let's get this straight. Walz hasn't been charged with a crime. This isn't about criminal guilt. This is about governing competence and moral responsibility. If your administration was responsible for protecting vulnerable people and hundreds of millions of dollars vanish while red flags pile up, you don't get to hide behind the absence of an indictment. That's not leadership. That's managerial malpractice. And here's the part I want the Wolfpack listeners to pay attention to. Here's the part Democrats need to stop dodging. If this were a Republican governor presiding over hundreds of millions of dollars in welfare fraud, Democrats would be on television around the clock using words like corruption, systemic failure, and dereliction of duty. There would be hearings. There would be outrage. There would be demands for resignations. No one would be saying this is complex. No one would be calling it unfortunate. No one would be bending over backwards to sound understanding. So Democrats don't get to suddenly lower the bar because the failure happened inside the tent. Accountability that only applies to the other side isn't accountability. It's branding. Tim Walz didn't step aside because the scandal went away. He stepped aside because it didn't. Because every explanation sounded worse the longer it went on. Because running for a third term as governor while explaining how this much money disappeared without anyone stopping it became politically radioactive. With Walz out of the race, Republicans smell blood in the water. Minnesota hasn't elected a Republican governor since 2006. But this is exactly how long droughts end. Not with a revolution, not with a landslide, but with an incumbent stepping aside under the weight of a scandal his party doesn't want to defend. Republicans didn't create this mess, but they didn't have to. All they have to do is point at it and ask one simple question. Who was in charge? That's what failed accountability buys you. You don't just lose credibility, you hand your opponents a weapon and pretend it's bad luck. And the political machine didn't pause. With Tim Walz gone, attention immediately shifted to Senator Amy Klobuchar, who met with Walz before his announcement and is now widely discussed as a potential candidate for governor. This is how the system protects itself. One piece moves off the board, another slides into place, and everyone pretends the underlying failure has been addressed. So the campaign ended quietly, strategically, with careful wording, sympathetic headlines. And that should piss you off. Because the people who are supposed to be helped by these programs, they don't get quiet exits. Families scrambling for childcare don't get press releases. Taxpayers don't get to opt out when their money is wasted at this scale. Only people in power get graceful exits. And now watch what happens next. The machine moves on. New candidates line up. Party insiders talk about the future, and Republicans talk about opportunity. Democrats talk about resetting the narrative, but the real issue stays buried. How did this happen for so long? Who ignored what warnings? Why did it take this much embarrassment for consequences to arrive? Until these questions are answered honestly, this isn't just a Minnesota problem, it's a Democratic Party problem, a credibility problem, a values problem. You don't get to campaign on protecting the vulnerable while tolerating systems that fail them this badly. You don't get to lecture the country about responsibility while dodging it at home. And if Democrats want voters to believe we actually mean what we say, accountability cannot stop at the party line. Tim Walz didn't walk away from this race because he was unlucky. He walked away because failure finally caught up with him. And that is the part we should not be afraid to say out loud. This became a very sad situation indeed. You want in your face? That's me. You want the truth up front? That's me. If you want podcasts that fake sincerity, chase outrage, and throw sensational headlines at you without doing the work, you probably should listen somewhere else. But if you want honesty, if you want truth without bias, if you want someone willing to call it out, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, that's me. Hopefully you stay for the ride, because I'm not slowing down and I'm not backing off. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad, and I'm taking names and I'm holding these people accountable. Everyone, lock in, keep alert, remain skeptical, but most of all, stay hopeful.